Welcome to Downtown Rotary, March 14th, also known by those in Mathfield as Pi Day. We're excited to have you here. We have a great turnout. And after a week break with the Summit League tournament and a break 3 weeks ago, excited to see so many of you back today. I'd ask that you first join me with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'd ask you to remain standing, and I'll have Daniel Hager come forward and share the invocation.
Good morning. Will you please pray with me? Lord, we thank you for time that we can gather together, just spend time learning and enjoying each other's company. As spring approaches, we thank you for your power over the seasons and the change that we see. And we pray that it would remind us that renewal is continuing and that we can be a part of that. Lord, we just thank you for our part in your plan. Thank you for Congressman Johnson, Lord, and the power and responsibility and courage that you've given him. I pray that you would have wisdom, good ethics, and just energy to serve South Dakota, Lord. Pray that you'd bless our conversation. Amen.
All right, thank you, Daniel. I want to welcome our guests. Many of you here today, if it's your first time joining us, welcome. And we're glad to see so many Rotarians here. I want to welcome junior Rotarians, and I believe we have 3 of them with us. John Costello from O'Gorman, could you please stand? Son of Rotarian and board member Pat Costello. John, great to have you here. Olivia Versteeg. Olivia, great to have you here, and you are here from Jefferson High School. So great to have a representative from Jefferson. And finally, we have Jonathan Skelton Roosevelt. Jonathan, welcome. Thanks for being here, all 3 of you. We look forward to hearing from you later in the month. We're going to move to Rotary business, and we have an induction today. I'm going to ask Tony Burke to come forward and introduce our newest Downtown Rotarian.
Well, good afternoon, President Tony, fellow Rotarians, and esteemed guests. Pleased to introduce you to the new Rotarian, Carrie Sanderson. Carrie serves as the first director of the Center for Prevention of Child Maltreatment at the University of South Dakota. As you may remember, Carrie presented to the club when CPCM was newly formed and is the driving force behind Jolene's Law, named after former Rotarian Jolene Letcher. CPCM's work has been felt in a very short period of time across the state of South Dakota. In getting to know Carrie, she is passionate about the well-being of our children across the state of South Dakota, as well as a visionary leader who drives change through collaboration. Please join me in welcoming Rotarian Carrie Sanderson to the podium, as she will share a little more about her personal and professional background. Carrie?
Good afternoon, and thank you for welcoming me today. I am an attorney by trade, and I've dedicated my career to helping make South Dakota communities healthier and safer for families and children. So I'm happy to find an organization that aligns not only with my personal goals, but my professional goals of making South Dakota as great as we can. And through that, I'd like to tell you just a bit about the Center for the Prevention of Child Maltreatment. That's a big name, so we call it CPCM. But the idea behind CPCM was a way for South Dakota to come together to look at data surrounding healthier families and children, to look at how we can work together to train our workforce, to be interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary in our responses, and then, of course, have some of the hard conversations that come with keeping our children safe. So with that, we work statewide with many of you in this room. We appreciate your time. And April is actually the National Child Abuse Prevention Month, amongst many things. And we invite you to join us anytime in the month of April to celebrate our healthy children and families. So just a little bit about me. I live in Flanders, South Dakota with my husband, my 3 beautiful daughters. We have a 4th one coming in about 6 weeks, and I'm happy to be here today and continue to get to know Rotary International. Thank you.
All right, as we welcome Congressman Johnson to the stage, we'll take a quick photo and I'll join him here shortly. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. You're no stranger to the stage at Downtown Rotary. We're excited to have you back, and want to welcome those that are joining us online, those Rotarians in the room. We have a full room, which is fantastic. A little bit about Congressman Johnson. Their one and only representative, or at-large representative for the state of South Dakota. Member of the Republican Party. You served as South Dakota's Public Utilities Commission, our commissioner from 2005 to 2011, prior to being appointed as Chief of Staff of the first Dugard administration. And that's a position you held through 2014. You were elected to your current role in 2018. So that would make you a second term representative for the state of South Dakota. So
bankers are so good at math.
Just wanted to,
So good.
for those of you that might be new to the state, that are not as familiar with Dusty, from Mitchell, where you live with your family, wife and 3 boys. So excited to have you here. A lot of pressing issues to get to. But I thought I'd just start. For a lot of us here in Sioux Falls, our attention has been either on legislative session that has been underway the last 75 days or so out in Pierre, or at least since the beginning of the year, or the geopolitical tensions and now war in Ukraine, which we're going to talk about here in a bit. Just bring us up to speed on what you've been up to. DC, while it's been in the news, hasn't been in the news to the extent that we're used to here, at least in Sioux Falls, from my perspective.
Well, first off, I want to thank everybody for having me back. It hasn't even been a year since you all had me. And that's unusual. Most groups, I think they feel like they're under some obligation to have me around. Even if they don't enjoy it, they think it's the right thing to do once a year, kind of like a prostate exam. And the fact that you guys are re-upping sooner than that means a lot to me. Thank you. As far as what my focus has been, Tony, I mean, a lot of my colleagues, I think, they spend a lot of their time in making a point. And I try to make progress. It does mean that I'm not in the media as much as certainly a lot of voters would like. I spent a fair amount of time at the sports show, the Sioux Falls Sports Show this weekend. And, probably the most, number one, everybody loves me as well, they should. But for those who don't know it yet, they'll often say, I just don't understand why our delegation isn't louder. Why aren't they screaming? Why aren't they banging on tables? And I try to explain to them that there is very little correlation between volume and effectiveness. And that is hard in an era where we want to view everything as tribal and everything is us versus them. There can be something reassuring about somebody who will fight for us. But I try to focus instead on fighting, on working. And so in December, I passed out my cattle contract library, which I'd done with Democrat Henry Cuellar of Texas, that makes the 4 large packers provide unprecedented information about what they're paying for cattle. I think that's a big deal. In December, and then again in January, we passed out my Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which I'm doing with Democrat John Garamendi of California, which would be the major, by far and away, the largest reform to our nation's maritime laws in 30 or 40 or 50 years, which will really affect the supply chain crunch. None of these things will ever lead the 6 o'clock evening news, but I think it's what members of Congress are supposed to be focused on.
Excellent. To your point, what does make the news is the fighting, is some of the dysfunction that we hear about. Talk to us about that, where we're at right now. We're heading into, or we are in an election year. How do things stand right now in terms of getting work done out in DC?
Well, most of the incentives in the system don't actually reward good behavior. It's a lot easier to raise money if you say crazy things all the time, right? And there's just not much of a market out there for people who know how to get a bill out of committee, if you will. Now, that being said, I'm an optimist. I mean, I think the system still largely works better than people realize. But there are a lot of the loudest voices really do make it harder to get things done. You know, if we had some sort of a TV show, Survivor-like competition where the normals in Congress got to vote out 20 on one side and 20 on the other side, that would only be 10% of the body, but the place would work 100% better. But in a democracy, you know, we don't give Dusty Johnson the ability to pick his coworkers.
Mm-hmm.
It's really too bad when you look at it that way.
Let's talk about something maybe we can agree on, something you've been working on. For those of us with kids, wake-up call came at what felt like an hour earlier this morning. Many of us felt that yesterday, feeling like we lost an hour of sleep. Talk to us about the Sunshine Protection Act and why you signed on as a co-sponsor.
Yeah, I've tried to be a leader in this. And interesting, people will most often complain to me about losing an hour of sleep. And that's probably not what motivates me so much. People will also talk about it, and I should back up. What the bill would do is put us on daylight saving time year round. There'd be no more bouncing back and forth between standard time and daylight savings. So, okay, yeah, that's, I mean, you know, I talk about passing important legislation, nothing, crickets out there. I talk about the clocks, and you guys are, you know, Googling Cocoa for Cocoa Puffs. But people also will complain about changing the clocks, and that used to be a bigger deal. So many of our clocks are updating themselves now, so that's not really my motivation. My motivation is during the dead of winter, we're only going to have 8 hours of sunlight in this state. So the question is, when should those 8 hours fall? And I think the hour we get in December from 8 to 9 a.m. is not worth anywhere near as much, because we're in school or we're at work, than having 4:30 to 5:30 be bright. And this really occurred to me 2 years ago. My middle son is crazy for trap shooting, and he wanted to go trap shooting, and it was maybe mid-November. And I took off work early. We loaded up the vehicle. By the time we got out there, it was evident to me that we were just not really going to have much time to shoot because it's got dark at 5 or 5:30. And so I'd like that hour toward the end of the day when people can recreate, walk with their spouses, go to the park, do a little trap shooting. It is the kind of thing that should happen, but you know, it's DC, so nothing easy happens easily.
What's your prediction? Is there bipartisan support to make this?
There is bipartisan support. I'm going to be honest. I don't think it's going to happen ever as a standalone bill. When we have changed daylight saving time, and we've done it a lot in this country's history, it's always been a part of a bigger package, either to save energy use or to staple it on for some other ostensible reason. It might happen in that way, but as a standalone, there are just, you know, even if it's a 70-30 issue, which it probably is a 70-30 issue, we have a hard time kind of overruling the will of the 30 very often.
Yeah. Let's talk about energy. It's been in the news often here recently. And just go back over a year ago, first day of President Biden's term, Keystone XL pipeline was canceled. Immediate reverberations here in South Dakota. National average gallon of gas is now over $4 a gallon, and that was before we cut off oil supply from Russia last week. You are a co-sponsor, my understanding, of the American Energy Independence Against Russia Act. Talk to us about that, and where do we go from here with regards to energy?
Well, the Ukraine, it's been a terrible tragedy. And I talked to Alla before we got started. She's from Ukraine, been a Sioux Fallsian for 10 years. But if you haven't had an opportunity to connect with her yet, she's a sharp one. I'm glad she's here. I'm glad she's an American, and I feel bad for her family that is having to deal with just unthinkable things that are happening. one silver lining of that terrible tragedy is it has actually, for the first time in my 3 years, it has meant that Republicans and Democrats are far more united on a major issue of the day than they are divided. And to the extent that there's been tension in the system, it hasn't really been R versus D. It's been more legislative branch versus executive branch, which is a more typical division, right? Congress, both sides of the aisle, have been united in, frankly, being far more proactive and aggressive in what we should be doing. The White House has been a little bit more of a laggard in that way. I think you saw that with the energy embargo. Hundreds of members of Congress were saying things like I was saying, which is, why is it that Europe and the United States would send $700 million a day to Vladimir Putin so that he can prosecute this war? And the White House was maybe a week late to that message, but ultimately, together, we got to the right place. And I think you'll see Europe start to move that way as well. It's far more difficult for them than it is for us. There'll be a price impact on us. They will have not just a price impact, but they'll have an availability impact as well. And they've done a lot of things like shut down their nuclear power plants across much of Europe. That was a mistake. I said it at the time they were doing it, and it certainly doesn't look any better now. And we get 96% of our natural gas from Canada. That's going to be available. It's a commodity market, so the price for that will go up, and we'll have to pay that. But we'll at least be able to get it. It is far more difficult for them, but that's the kind of thing we need to do. We see the ruble has collapsed. We see the Moscow stock market, if they ever turn it on again, it will have lost 70 or 80% of its value. This will be the third week that Putin has not allowed the exchange to open. And we are seeing an economy that is very much on collapse, on the verge of collapse. Putin will likely be able to secure his short-term military goals. His military is just too big. But he's already lost. He has lost economically, and he is not, this insurgency is so much stronger than he ever imagined. He, 2 days ago, put the head of his intelligence force and the deputy under house arrest. And I would expect that any day now, those two gentlemen will be executed. And it's clear to me that Putin is already trying to establish a scapegoat. He expected that they would be welcomed as liberators rather than as invaders. That has not been the case. So confident, Tony, were they that this would be a quick victory, that they had their soldiers pack dress uniforms rather than extra food or ammunition. There was going to be a parade in downtown Kyiv, of course. And as somebody at my table said beforehand, well, that parade was canceled. I hope it's canceled for a long time, but it's going to be difficult. I think the intermediate prospects for the Ukrainian command and control centralized government is not very good.
Let's stay on Ukraine. So it seems to have NATO aligned. You talk about unification. NATO seems to have rallied here. That said, Ukraine is not a NATO country. So we, along with our NATO allies, are attempting to walk this balance of supporting Ukraine, but yet not getting pulled in or causing a larger conflict. How would you evaluate or assess our approach thus far?
Well, we've been slow in almost all ways, but we have generally been pretty quick to catch up. I'll give an example. The first round of sanctions on the first Friday of the invasion, the first tranche from both Europe and the United States were really underwhelming. They were very garden variety. I do not think they were tailored to the size and the scope of the moment. And so you saw, parliamentary members and members of Congress across the transatlantic partnership really be upset and in a unified way. And as a result, over the course of the weekend, the central governments in most all of those states got their act together. And by Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you saw a second and a third tranche of those sanctions. Now, some people might say, well, it took time to get these things pulled together. That's certainly what the White House has said, but we had months where ostensibly we were preparing. And I know in Congress, we were talking a lot about it. What exactly would primary sanctions look like? What would secondary sanctions look like? What could we freeze? We've, in particular, and also with the military aid, in general, we have been a week or 10 days late to do everything. Early on in our briefings, the Pentagon was saying, well, we can't get these S-300 air defense systems to them because it'll take them too long to get up to speed on them. right? They won't help immediately. Well, now we're 3 weeks in, and we would have been well served. And the Ukrainian people would have been well served by us making that transfer. We're making the same mistake now with these Polish MiG fighters. You know, Poland doesn't want to provide them directly to Ukraine. They don't want to have their pilots fly them into Ukraine because they're pretty sure the Russians will shoot them down. So they want to fly them to Berlin to have American pilots take, in essence, ownership our country, and then have our pilots fly them into Ukraine. I have 90% of the members of Congress that I have talked to about this topic in the last 7 days are all for it. And I understand the reticence. We do not want to escalate. But the Ukrainian people are not asking for us to fight this battle for them. They're not asking for American men and women in uniform to die on Ukrainian battlefields. They're asking for us to provide them the tools so they can defend themselves. And that's what we should do. And so I think the next tranche, call it tranche 6 or 7 of assistance, should be those drones they're asking. It should be the S-300s they're asking for. It should be the MiG fighters. And it absolutely should be the imposition of a breathtakingly broad set of secondary sanctions that by and large we've not unlocked yet.
Yeah. More to come on that, and we're all praying for those involved and hoping for resolution. But it appears it's going to be a long haul. We've all watched the military invasion, and that for us is pretty. We can see that. Talk to us about the cyber components and the informational warfare that's at use in this this fight, not only against the Ukrainians, but what are you hearing, your colleagues, as a nation? Are we at higher risk right now? I assume we are. But what are we in for here with the Russians in terms of cyber warfare?
Yeah, we are at a much bigger risk now, although I would tell you the baseline of where we've been for the last 3 years has been much higher than most Americans realize. Much higher. I mean, just think about last year. You had Russian-affiliated actors who brought down 1/2 of all of the gasoline capacity on the eastern seaboard when they brought down the Colonial Pipeline. And I think that was met with by mostly a collective shrug by Americans, and shame on us. Right? Had 1/2 of the gasoline capacity been taken down by conventional weapons, I think our reaction would have been far more pointed and proactive. 1/2 of all of the nation's meat processing capacity, 1/3 of all of the nation's meat processing capacity was brought down the next week when Russian-affiliated actors brought down the JBS system. And that, again, was kind of a collective shrug. And I get that both parties right now, their messages and their political actions are designed to excite and engage the base. I get it. But how much better off would our country have been if Joe Biden, Kevin McCarthy, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer, the 5 of them had gone into a room after those back-to-back attacks and said, we're not going to come out until the 5 of us agree on a national coordinated cybersecurity strategy. And we're going to pursue that for the next month until we get it done, as opposed to Build Back Better or overturning ACA or whatever else the base might have been more engaged at in that moment. We could have done that. We should have done that a year ago. And I think we would be very much bearing fruit for those efforts. As a result, a lot of the water that's being carried in this fight is being carried by private industry, by really incredible actors. White hat folks. I mean, our military and our civilian governmental employees are doing a lot too to protect our national infrastructure, but a lot of the defense work is being carried out by you all or the people you employ. And I think it's a suboptimal way to run the system.
Yeah. We're going to see, of course, we had announcements here locally and a state level around cyber investments, and good to know that we're going to be part of the a potential solution against those types of warfare. Let's talk veterans. South Dakota, Sioux Falls has a long history of supporting our veterans. Just within the last week, and I think there was even some more over the weekend that came out, 84-page report about the Veterans Administration and recommendations for either closing or modifying a number of facilities. Point to Hot Springs, Wagner, Fort Meade, and even in Sioux Falls, it sounds like potentially moving that emergency room to an urgent care facility. Talk to us about that, your thoughts on that, and how does this play out?
Yesterday, I got an email from Lola Jackson, who lives in Sioux Falls, and she sent me an email. It's a really long one. It detailed the serious health problems that her husband has had for years, and they lived in the suburbs of Minneapolis, and very happy. That's what their family was. That's where their careers were. But the Sioux Falls VA facilities had such a sterling reputation that they moved to this community for that facility. The wait times by the numbers were so much lower. The outcome metrics were so much higher. And they have been happy being here, I think, for 5 years, I think her note said. And they are really talking about a huge number of changes. So just to put a little more meat on the bone here, yes, Wagner, their clinic would be entirely shut down. All inpatient services in Sioux Falls would be discontinued. Yes, the emergency room would be discontinued here. In Hot Springs and Fort Meade, all inpatient would go away. Any residential facilities in those communities would go away. And so it is a big list of changes. And I would say this, I get it. I mean, we should be thoughtful and deliberate about what the VA system of the future looks like. We don't want to just inherit these vestiges or legacies and accept them because we have a fixed pot of dollars. It will certainly get bigger over the years, but it's never going to be as big as it needs to be. And so the question, I think, for VA and for all of us should be, how do we best serve veterans with the resources we have? And it may well be that some structural changes across the country would be necessary to best serve veterans. But these specific proposals, number one, go way too far. And number two, specifically with Hot Springs, I think it's a betrayal. And I think you guys know me. I don't use sort of hyperbolic verbiage like that kind of ever. But in the 3 years that I've been in Congress, every year I have been successful, as have our senators, in inserting language into the annual appropriations bills that say that the VA cannot use any of the dollars that Congress has put in to close or discontinue any services in Hot Springs, South Dakota. It's not easy to get that language in. It certainly wasn't easy even to keep it in. Secretary McDonnell of the VA said that if we got rid of that verbiage, that he would come, no, it wasn't McDonnell, sorry, it was his successor, that they would come to Hot Springs and they would announce that the Hot Springs VA was staying open and there'd be no reduction of services. It's a massive victory. We cut that deal. Christy Nour, Dusty Johnson, Mike Rounds, John Thune, we went there to Hot Springs. We stood with the secretary and he announced that Hot Springs was going to stay open. And I get it. There's been an election since then. There's a new sheriff in town, new head of the VA, new president. But we can either live in a world where a cabinet secretary showing up in your county and making a promise means something beyond the next election, or where it doesn't mean anything. And I just told you guys about how, I'm not a big fighter, but I will tell you what, the four of us will be united in bringing like an unholy fury to these suggestions because it is such a bait and switch. And because I don't think the suggestions are very well tailored to the actual needs of the veterans. There are 577 veterans who get their primary care at the Wagner facility. You guys know Wagner a lot better, I suspect, than the people in Washington, D.C. who put this report out. Do you know what the next nearest VA facility is from Wagner? You guys, I suspect, understand the socioeconomic challenges and some of the racial challenges facing southern Charles Mix County. Talk about a suggestion that is tone deaf to the real needs of that almost 600 veterans who we have made commitments to. So by all means, let's evolve the system. Let's improve it. That will mean making changes, and not all of those changes will be politically popular. But Tony, this is too far.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and we'll see. Those are recommendations at this point, but a long way to go. Long way to go on that. And thank you for sharing your insight on that. Let's stay on spending. So we see recommendations for
You got me all lathered into a thick lather there.
Take a drink here. We're But I want to keep this this topic on spending really around national debt, and we can't help but we're going to talk about inflation. But 2 years ago, we found ourselves on the precipice of a pandemic. Federal Reserve and Congress said, "All right, we're going to attack this thing decisively with dollars," and that's what happened, like we've never seen before. So we had that response. We sit here today, 2 years later, national debt's over $30 trillion. Federal Reserve's balance sheet is over $9 trillion. Inflation is now a conversation for families and businesses. All that being said, it strikes me that there's a general apathy around the debt when it comes to Washington, D.C., and in a lot of cases, Americans. I could be wrong. I hope I am. But talk to us about the national debt. What conversations are happening, and then how do we land this plane coming out of this pandemic response?
Sure. Well, first off, with inflation, it doesn't need to be this bad. And some people will say, "Oh, well, listen, inflation is everywhere in the developed world. This is not. We can't blame this on the stimulus packages. It's everywhere." Well, it's half the rate in Europe that it is here. And that is not usual, by the way. Normally, Europe has a more inflationary environment than we do. And most of the economic analysis that I've analyzed indicates that about half of the inflationary pressure that we're experiencing is because of loose fiscal policy in this country. Our spending on the pandemic and the recession, the shortest recession in recorded time, by the way, was more than twice what it was per capita in Europe. In the April, and I voted for the early COVID packages. I think they were necessary. Things like PPP, yes, we overshot a little bit, but I think I'll allow both sides of the aisle. I'll allow everybody a lot of liberty to overshoot when you're in the fog of war. But the recession ended in May, not last May, the May before that. And so the package we passed in April of last year was a year after the recession. It was not necessary. We gave states and localities quadruple what they needed, according to Moody's, quadruple what they needed to deal with COVID. Inflation is defined from the textbook perspective as too many dollars chasing too few goods. Government owns both halves of this equation. Not all of it, but much of it. We put a lot more money on the street, and we had policies in place that did not encourage a return to work. We still have a workforce participation rate in this country that is lower than it was pre-pandemic. We look at the unemployment rate, it's the wrong number. It's the wrong number. You only show up in the unemployment rate if you are getting a UI check. But there are millions of Americans who are able to subsist on other programs who don't need to go out and look for a job every single week to qualify for UI. And so we've got fewer people working in this country than we did pre-pandemic. Again, people want to say, well, Dusty, but we had all of these early retirees. If somebody saved and they decided they want to retire early at 62 because of the pandemic, I don't view that as a loss. Do I wish they were working? Does it make it harder for me to get a speedy steak? Yes, but that's freedom, right? That was a choice they made. That's not what I'm talking about. That is about a third of the loss in workers, those early retirees. The rest of it is a lot of people who previously were working and still are not back. The overwhelming majority of them are men. I know we want to view childcare, and childcare is tremendously important, but it's a problem that existed prior to the pandemic as well. So the unique pandemic experience is it's a little bit more about childcare, but most of the people that have not returned are not the primary caregivers of their children. And so this government owns a lot of this, and I'm frustrated by that. Now, that also makes the debt worse, because when you spend, a new $1 trillion package seemingly every 6 months, that at some point has to get paid for. We have made the decision as a country that we want to increase our standard of living today by reducing the standard of living for our children and our grandchildren. We're taking their money and we're bringing it forward. And if we were in the Great Depression, that could make a lot of sense. There is a role for counter-cyclical debt spending in government. Now is not the time. And to the extent that we continue to do it, I think is a real failure of fiscal policy.
Let's stay on. So you talked about inflation. and we got you fired up on a
I
couple
know.
different things here. But
I should just talk about my kids. Let me tell you about how they're doing, and we'll smile and we'll laugh.
we'll get to that. And I do
Yeah.
want to, because we are going to have time here, about 12:35. We are going to have time for questions from Rotarians. I have a couple more, but I would love to hear. And Dusty said he's ready for anything today, and we got his heart rate up a little bit, so he is ready to go. But let's talk about you brought it up for any of us that have ordered furniture, Christmas gifts, getting things on time or built anything. It's a challenge. There's inflationary components that are related to that, but you go a little deeper on this Ocean Shipping Reform Act that you've been involved in. My understanding that you said passed the House in December. Has that got legs? Is that gonna happen?
Well, things happen more slowly in the Senate just because so many of them take naps throughout the afternoon. And so we'll get it done, but it'll take a little while longer, I think. Okay, so I've had a lot of my colleagues, dozens of them, sort of churlishly ask me, well, Dusty, I see that you're the lead guy on this Ocean Shipping Reform Act. Which of the major maritime ports are in South Dakota, right? And kind of an acknowledgement that it's an odd fit, at least on the surface level. But you guys get it. 60% of the soybeans grown in this state are exported overseas. We, thank goodness, we have a manufacturing sector in this country, as well as beef, dairy, corn, beans, where a majority of that output is exported. And so ocean shipping is tremendously important. Now, I'm a big believer in the free market, but the free market has many buyers and many sellers. And when you get too much concentration, you lose kind of the invisible hand of the free market, keeping everybody honest and fair. So in 1980, the 5 largest ocean shippers controlled 15% of the traffic between Asia and the United States. Now they control 75%. And none of the 5, so now they're big behemoths, right? None of those 5 are American flagged. They're all foreign flagged. And I'm not one of these guys who in a xenophobic way wants to say, foreign companies are bad, but it does mean that sometimes their interests don't well align with ours. And that is true right now. We have demand for consumer electronics in this country 40% higher than pre-pandemic. That shows you how loose the fiscal policy has been, that we have that much more consumer demand. So there's just a huge traffic jam of products coming from Asia, where they're strong in consumer electronics, trying to get into America. That means the ocean carriers don't want to wait around for our cargo. There has been an unprecedented level of refusals to haul American goods, rejections, which they can do contractually because they set the contract terms. Again, not a free market with many buyers, many sellers where you're negotiating. This is a take it or leave it contract. There's an asymmetry of power. So the contracts have a laughably small amount of liquidated damages, sometimes $100 a container load for rejections. So yes, they're contractually obligated to haul our manufactured goods and our ag goods, but they will reject that container load, even if it's sitting there, so that they don't have to wait the 6 hours to load it up, and they can get a quicker turn back to Asia so Americans can get their iPhones. This is not theoretical. 60% of all of the containers that went back to Asia last year went back empty. Talk to Valley Queen. They had containers of lactose with a buyer already established in Asia that sat on the dock at Long Beach for 75 days. No carrier would touch it. Of course, the lactose spoiled. The American dairy industry in just 6 months last year lost $1.3 billion because of that spoilage on the docks. It's a remarkable amount. And so what my Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and Garamendi, Mr. Garamendi from California, our Ocean Shipping Reform Act would say, if you're going to use American ports, you have to submit yourself to basic rules of the road. You're in essence a common carrier who uses American infrastructure, so you are not allowed to unreasonably discriminate against American goods. I think it's exactly the right standard. The president name-checked us, not by name, but by issue in the State of the Union address 2 weeks ago, and I think we're going to get some momentum. We have Klobuchar Thune in the Senate that have introduced that, and I think we're picking up some momentum.
Excellent. Well, thank you for unpacking that for us and your work. It's important to a lot of us South Dakotans and those across the country. One more, and then we'll open it up here. Let's talk. We got midterms here in November. History will tell you that the party that is in the White House often gives up seats at the 2
Well, they don't give them up, Tony.
They lose
Yeah,
congressional
right.
seats.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As we look to November, what are those issues that are important to Americans, and how do you see this playing out both in the House and Senate?
Yeah, you're right. Historically, the mid-year numbers for the president's party is to lose 31. Speaker Pelosi has a 4-seat margin right now. So, 31 would get it done and then some. Now, I think my party is really good at messaging issues in a way that engages the base. I don't think it's as good in putting out messaging that engages swing voters. I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there, right? So it's not hard to imagine that Republicans might underperform a little bit. But I also think the political environment is much worse for Joe Biden than it is for a standard incumbent, right? So that works the other way. So, maybe we give up 10 because the messaging's not a great fit with the time, but maybe Biden costs him another 10. 30 is probably a pretty decent number. I think the real question is going to be, are the Republicans prepared to govern, particularly if the Democrats hold the Senate? Of course, Joe Biden will still be in the White House. There's a lot of turnover in the House. My class was almost 100. The next class was 70 or 80. This class will probably be 100. So that's not quite 300 people out of 435. People think folks go to D.C. and stay there forever. That's not true in the House. There's a tremendous amount of turnover. And so I think you'll probably have a situation where a majority of Republicans in the House will have never voted for a debt ceiling increase. That would have been something that always would have been done with Democrat votes. And so the question will be, well, now that we kind of own that procedure in the House, is there a path forward for the Republicans in getting that done? Working with perhaps Leader Chuck Schumer and the Democrats in the Senate. It's going to be kind of a messy time regardless. Now, that being said, there are going to be some really good things that I think will happen. Two that I'll mention. Number one, Republicans have been a lot more accurate on the need to decouple key industries from China. Again, I'm a believer in the free trade, but I don't think that adversaries should have control over food, medicine, or energy. I think that's too much leverage. And there would be a lot of countries that I'd put on that list, but Russia and China would certainly be two of them. And we've just been a lot more thoughtful and deliberate, I think, in articulating exactly what that would look like. I've got bills. And again, a lot of these seem like relatively narrow blocking and tackling. It's not like it's one bill that has a magic wand. It's about making sure, my bill would say that when it comes to equipment that we get for key homeland security tactics or tasks, that we don't buy that stuff from China. And there's a lot of legislation like that I think would make sense. That would be one. The second would be on discretionary spending. Most of the spending is on autopilot. There's really not an easy way for any one party to address that. And that's the real debt problem, by the way. But on the discretionary side, Republicans have traditionally been a lot better on holding the line on that. Kind of the rhetoric is, both parties are so terrible at the spending. No, it's not really true. As I mentioned last year in front of you guys, after 8 years of Republican control, discretionary spending was lower, not like adjusted for inflation, in actual nominal dollars, was lower at the end of that 8 years than it was at the beginning. And so I think we'll have more people in positions of power in the House. I think we'll want to really analyze spending rather than sort of risking on an overshoot.
Yeah, excellent. I think we have a couple traveling mics. If we have questions in the audience, and while you're potentially raising your hand, I have a question related to. You ready? All right, Nikki, go ahead. Quick.
Thank you for being with us today,
thanks, Nikki.
Congressman. A question I have is, oil is a finite product, and it's controlled by some of the worst nation actors on the planet. The market itself is controlled by fear, as we saw this morning. Oil is now under $100 a barrel because COVID fears in China, they're fearing another lockdown. So why do we continue to subsidize oil and not look at renewable energies that we have right here, like sun, wind, which we've got lots of here in South Dakota?
Yeah. Well, first off, Nikki, I want to compliment you for your leadership in talking about some of these renewable fuels. It's not as though I agree with everything you tweet, but when you're talking about energy, I think in a lot of ways, you are making some good points. And there has been a lot of American leadership with regards to carbon. I'm going to double back to how oil has been can play a toxic role in our foreign policy. So I'm going to double back to your direct question. But in the last few years, America has reduced its carbon footprint by more than the next 15 carbon reducing countries combined. It is an amazing amount of environmental leadership that I just don't know that anybody in the world gives us any credit for. I'm not saying that we are where we need to be. I'm not saying that there isn't a lot more we can do, but no country's ever done what we have already done. In fact, you look back to the bills of 10 and 15 years ago that were going to institute dramatic changes or reductions in our carbon allowance. Markey Waxman or the Barbara Boxer bill. We're below those allowances. I mean, we're meeting our Paris Accords to a greater degree than any other country in the world. In the last few years, Europe's more command and control approach has increased their carbon footprint by 2%, while ours is down 2%. Again, there's a lot more that we need to do, but there's been a tremendous investment in renewables. And I would say for some of my colleagues on the right who 10 and 15 years ago and 20 years ago were saying that renewables were so expensive they were never going to make it worse. Well, the reality is most utilities, the extent that they choose wind today, are doing so not because of a mandate, but because wind plus natural gas, you got to have the natural gas to back it up, is the lowest cost solution toward meeting the safety, reliability, and affordability needs of ratepayers. And so I think there's a lot of success story there. I feel sick that Europe is as dependent on Russian oil as they are. I feel sick that we are and I wouldn't say that we're nowhere near as dependent as Europe is, but I don't like the fact that we are not allowed to just pay attention to Middle Eastern politics as they relate to humanitarian or global security issues, but energy policy is clearly also in the mix. And that's one reason why I feel like as we move toward renewables, and we need to, I think we also need to have a bias for North American fossil fuels. And if you care about the environment, and we should be using North American energy. Jennifer Granholm, she's the Secretary of Energy. Her politics aren't mine. But you know what she said a month ago? Russian natural gas is the dirtiest natural gas in the history of the world. We should have been shipping out American liquefied natural gas to Europe. Now, for other reasons, we decided we didn't want to invest in LNG terminals at ports. And so we denied Europe access to our product. So they turned to the Russians. You want to look at oil. North American oil is 23% less greenhouse gas intensive than Russian oil. Not so much because of carbon, because of methane. Canada and the United States have controls in place. You're not just allowed to just let methane be released. We capture that as well. We should. And of course, in Russia, they don't. And methane is a big greenhouse gas. And so to the extent that anybody is buying Russian gas instead of Canadian gas or American gas, it is making the planet far dirtier, the equivalent of 100 million additional cars on the road. So yeah, we need to move away from those dirtiest and most tyrannical sources of energy.
Other questions?
So my question is on the topic of Russian aggression towards non-NATO countries. At what point, if any, would you want military intervention? And does the West's inaction on military intervention in Ukraine give the green light to China to invade Taiwan?
Thanks, John. Good questions.
Yeah, it is a good question. And even with something very limited, like a no-fly zone, because I think that's gaining some momentum in Congress. Why don't we just, Zelensky is passionately, he's going to address us in a joint address on Wednesday, and he's certainly going to call for a no-fly zone again. But even with the no-fly zone, how do we enforce that? The Russians will break the no-fly zone. Will our no-fly zone have no teeth? Or will we shut down the Russian fighters or bombers? I don't think any of us can comprehend what an escalation of that Russia versus the Western world legitimate war would look like. My Democratic colleague from Minnesota, Dean Phillips, he and I do a lot of things together, and he and I were it was a closed-door Problem Solvers Caucus meeting, so I probably shouldn't be talking out of school, but I'm among friends and everybody here online. I tried to explain how terrible that conflict could be, and that we had better make sure that as we help the Ukrainians defend themselves, that we do that in a way that does not make World War III more likely. And some of my colleagues nodded politely at me, but then Dean spoke a couple speakers later, and he said, he was making the same points I made, but he made them a lot stronger. He said, 1968, my father was killed in Vietnam. And I think in the decades since then, my mother and my siblings have occasionally had cause to wonder whether or not his death could have been avoided. I don't want any families to have to wonder those things as we deal with what I think is our humanitarian, moral, ethical, and global security obligation to help Ukraine. And so even with sort of a partial measure of a no-fly zone, I think it's really hard to figure out how us getting involved militarily would make the world safer rather than less safe. Now, that being said, I think when it comes to almost anything else the Ukrainians want, we should deliver it. Now, with regard specifically, John, to Taiwan, I do think our stated obligations to Taiwan are substantially more explicit than what they have been to Ukraine. And I would also note, every single day, there are people being oppressed. There are strong men that are killing people and murdering them because of who they are, the land that they live on. And although we should do what we can to help those people, I also want to make sure that we don't have a drastically, this is one of the first ever conflicts where the victims look exactly like us. They're wearing Champion sweatshirts, and the kids have iPhones and tennis shoes. And that is more jarring to us. But it doesn't mean that their lives are worth more than, there will be, unfortunately, terrible people across the globe every single day. So we just want to make sure that before we get ourselves involved militarily, we're making sure that we're setting a standard that America can live up to. Is it indeed our stated goal to use all our military might to make sure that no one in the world suffers? Or does our appetite for intervention need to be a little more tailor-made to our capacity?
Mike?
Thank you for sharing your candid insights with us. We appreciate you. Thank you for sharing your candid insights with us. We appreciate it. Thank you. Great Britain in the 1800s was the world power. In the 1900s, America came into its own. It seems like in the 2000s, there's some competition from China. Is the United States going to have to get used to being number two? And if so, how would we prevent that?
I think China has a very high floor, but a very low ceiling. I think when you have the kind of police state that they have, entrepreneurship and innovation is just not going to flourish the way that it is here. We have our problems, don't get me wrong. But I would much rather be holding the American hand of cards than the Chinese hand of cards. They have a certain number of advantages that we don't. I get it. But you still, in this country, can decide that you're going to form a business largely in the way you want. You're going to hire people in largely the way you want. You're going to do product development in largely the way you want. And that creates a certain set of innovative benefits that a more planned economy simply doesn't have. And even as China has at times allowed more private sector investment, they still are shockingly locked down on First Amendment type rights. And it means that economy is, again, I think they're going to struggle because that's not an environment where innovators want to create new things. Tony Blair, who I greatly admire, the former Labor Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, came to DC 2 months ago, and he didn't go to talk to the Democratic leadership or the Republican leadership. He didn't. When he was in DC, he came to talk to the Problem Solvers Caucus, the bipartisan group that I'm a part of, 29 Democrats, 29 Republicans. And he spent 90 minutes with us, kind of talking about our shared view. And I think the one threat that we need to guard against in this country, if we want to continue to be, the world's superpower, is we got to get our politics under control. Tony Blair said that American political dysfunction is a global security threat. For any of you who view yourself as partisan street fighters, who love to take to Twitter and own the other side because it's fun, you're contributing to that. And sometimes do the politicians on the right or left deserve to be called out? Yes, of course. That's what makes for a healthy democracy. But increasingly, it seems like the partisan infighters are calling out the other side in a way that weakens America rather than strengthens it. That's a global security threat I don't think any of us should view cavalierly. That's not a problem President Xi has, by the way.
Other questions for Congressman Johnson? You answered them all. We got-
No,
Thank you very much for joining us today. So my question really relates to nuclear confrontation. So Russia has already put its nuclear forces on alert, and I assume we are too. Let's say, play a scenario out where Russia says, you know what, I'm so tired of mucking around with this little fighting in Kiev. I'm going to just drop a bomb on Ukraine and then see what happens. What is going to be our reaction at that point in time?
Yeah, part of having a deterrent strategy is at times, sometimes having strategic ambiguity about it. And in fact, with Taiwan, that's been our foreign policy for some decades, having some strategic ambiguity about exactly how we would respond. We have not put our nuclear forces on alert, a heightened alert, as has Russia, in part because we don't want to escalate. We believe that he's saber rattling. We believe that he's doing that to try to make us back down. And we don't want to create an even more heightened sense of drama and stress and threat across the globe. So we have not. Now, we've done that before. In the 1990s, the exact same thing happened. Russia went on, I suppose, Soviet Union. Well, no, that was 89. So yeah, so Russia went on more heightened alert, and we did not. We did not respond in kind. Specifically with regard to tactical nuclear, which would not be these ICBM type missiles, but would be more of a battlefield type deployment. It would absolutely have devastating impacts. And we have not seen their use. And if you pray, I think you should pray that doesn't happen, because there are no good choices for humanity if a madman takes that first step. I don't know exactly what we would do, but it would be terrible either way, anyway.
I don't want to end on that.
You guys are just a barrel of monkeys.
How's your? We're right at 1 o'clock. Send us off with some optimism. What's going on with your family?
Sure. Well, let me just say this. If you get downhearted about the state of American politics, I have two things that I want to say to you. Number one, don't allow what's happening in social media. Don't extrapolate that to what's happening in the real world. Go to the South Dakota State Fair, go to the home show, go to the sportsman show. When you talk to real people, they're pretty happy, right? They may, when they talk about politics, they may get kind of crusty and upset, but in general, Americans still love America, and they still love Americans. Even their idiot cousin who posts crazy stuff on Facebook, they love him too. And so Twitter is not real life. The second thing I would say is, if you're a normal, if you're an optimist who believes in American exceptionalism and that we have something to offer the world for the next 100 years as well, or 245 years for that matter, don't be so quiet about it. In any given day on the social media platforms that my office engages in, 5 people on the right, 5 angry people on the right, and 5 angry people on the left will contribute 70% of the traffic. I just feel like increasingly, because we are so frustrated with them, we are abdicating the city square to them. And I'm not asking you to become a keyboard warrior. I'm not asking you to go take these people on, every day in some sort of a battle, to the death. But don't be so quiet about the fact that there are good things going on in this country. And that if we can work together, we'll be able to do even more of them. So,
Excellent.
thanks for your time.
Please join me in thanking Congressman Johnson. Thank you. We have Don Barnett, South Dakota Hall of Famer and mayor during the 1972 flood out in Rapid City. Got quite a story. You won't want to miss it. So please join us again next Monday. Have a great week. Thanks.